Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at North Kentucky University. I've admired Tyler Cowen's work for years, and so when he said he'd be happy to come on the show to talk about the Complacent class, I was definitely excited. Now, adding considerably to the natural excitement you'll hear in my voice is the effect of the Sudafed I popped before the interview to deal with this cold I've managed to pick up. So if you're a long-time listener wondering, why does Mike sound so ramped up? Now you know. With that out of the way, here's my interview with Tyler Cowen. My guest today is Tyler Cowen. In addition to being a professor of economics at George Mason University, he blogs at Marginal Revolution, hosts the Conversations with Tyler podcast, is a regular contributor at Bloomberg View, and is the author of a number of books, including The Great Stagnation, An Economist Gets Lunch, which is my wife's personal favorite, Average is Over, and most recently, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream, which recently came out in paperback. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
You know, I thought we would start off, as social scientists often do, by sort of defining our terms, or at least one of them. Obviously, the key term, I would say, in the case of the complacent class is, well, the complacent class. So could we start by you sort of giving us an explanation of what you mean by that?
The book as a whole, The Complacent Class, is about how Americans are less mobile than they used to be, how they take less risk, and overall how they've lost the capacity to imagine a future very different from the present we know. The title itself, The Complacent Class, has a kind of inside joke to it. It's not any single class that's the complacent class, as in the rich or the poor or the well-educated, but we all have become the complacent class. So at lower levels of income, you see people living with their parents for longer periods of time, or maybe not looking for work at all. The overall rate at which we protest or even riot has gone down. Crime rates have gone down. Of course, that's a good thing. There's a lot to be said for complacency, but there's a negative side too. But also at higher income levels, there's much more credentialism. The rate at which people start new businesses has fallen for decades. And there are many other phenomena that would apply to higher earning Americans. So in short, we're all the complacent class.
Now, there are obviously a lot of ways to measure this, a lot of indicators of our increasing complacency, but are there any that you feel are particularly telling?
Well, to me, the single best measure of complacency is mobility across state lines is down consistently for decades. Americans are no longer restless to move, but also just productivity growth. Other than Silicon Valley and the tech sector, American productivity performance has been quite abysmal, and this makes our economy worse. It makes it harder to pay the bills. You see this showing up in many particular spheres of American life. It's really hard, say, to support a family on just one income in a lot of the more desired places to live in this country, and we're innovating less.
Do you think the lack of mobility, I mean, obviously this is, multiple things would determine this, but is it part because that just because it used to be you would maybe move from the South to the North to get jobs in, say, the automobile industry or things like that. Is this sort of a reflection of the fact that we don't really see these pockets anymore outside of maybe some places like, I don't know, Austin or San Francisco?
That's right. There are fewer booming pockets. And one of the booming pockets you mentioned, San Francisco, it costs so much to live there because we won't let people build more. Think of NIMBY as another manifestation of the complacent class. There's actually net migration out of San Francisco, even though it's been in the midst of one of the world's greatest technological revolutions ever. That's another illustration of this. There's been some movement into Texas. That's a good thing. But overall, parts of the country are more like each other. So to be a dentist in Columbus, Ohio, or Denver, Colorado, it's just not that different. There aren't that many reasons to move, not that much dynamism.
With the issue of the rents and building regulations and those sort of things, wouldn't it? I mean, you would think that it would be at least in part somewhat of a self-correcting problem when they would get too high in, say, San Francisco. I know that there are a number of people who have moved to places like Austin. So will this eventually, do you think, just sort of take care of itself?
Well, eventually is a tricky word. The economies of clustering seem to be stronger than we used to realize. So if you do tech, you really want to be in Silicon Valley or San Francisco. And Austin or Brooklyn, there are other places, which are, by the way, no longer so cheap themselves. But you don't have the same personal contacts, the same peer group, the same people to talk to. So just how much a lot of our productivity relies on other productive people being around us, that's turned out to be really important.
And I'm guessing that even now, Skype chats and things like that just can't take the place of the sort of face-to-face interactions that you would get in those areas.
Some companies are rebelling against telecommuting, and there were all these books from the 90s, Death of Distance. Well, you don't see that in the rents. You really don't. Same is true for London, by the way.
Now, there's one thing a lot of folks, at least especially on the left, I would say, look at is median household income. And you talk about it in the Complacent class, and you note that it's actually down since the year 2000. I pulled up some data on that, but it seemed to me that if you draw a trend line, say from the 80s to the present, it actually is at least somewhat on the rise. In the last few years, there's been a pretty sharp increase, it looks to me. And others folks would say, well, households are smaller today, and really CPI isn't the right measure to use. We should be using chain CPI instead of CPI-U. And if you combine all that together, actually gains in median income are a lot greater than what are commonly reported. And I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, the relevant question is still, what are gains like over the last, say, 40 years compared to an earlier America? And it used to be that living standards almost doubled every generation, and no one thinks that's true anymore. If you look, say, at 1973, median household income since then is up a pretty meager amount. But I think the best comparison is simply male median wage, because we would all agree women are earning more, they're becoming more educated. It's not technological progress, it's just, more people working. And male median wage is actually, where it was more or less around 1970. I agree that's a mismeasurement, but that such a mismeasurement is even possible, I think says it all. No one in 1970 expected that would be the case.
One thing I'm wondering is, to what extent are we, I'd say responsible isn't quite the right word, but it seems to me, and this kind of gets into one of your previous books, The Great Stagnation, when you talk about the low-hanging fruit, the simple things we could do to grow very quickly. It was technological innovations, smart, uneducated kids, and a lot of land. And obviously, we ran out of, well, not ran out, but we kind of hit some barriers on a lot of those things too. So I'm wondering if this sort of complacency, this lack of mobility and growth, if it's just sort of a natural phenomenon.
Oh, very much so. You see a version of this in Japan and much of Western Europe. The countries that are selling a lot of natural resources to China, basically Canada, Australia, they've avoided it somewhat. Good for them. I would say that was a kind of exogenous luck. But people figure, well, if we can't have dynamism, we might as well be safe. And so we've dug ourselves in more and more. It's perfectly understandable as a response.
Well, some people might actually push back on this and say, well, wait a minute. In the last, say, 10 years, we've seen over 10, 15 years, there's, Facebook, Twitter, Google, the entire smartphone thing. And my world is very different, how I spend my time, what I do. And so how can you say that this isn't a dynamic country still when most of the big tech innovations are still coming out of the United States?
Well, that part of our economy is dynamic. But if you compare that, say, to the 1920s, when there were also incredible revolutions in communications, radio, telephone, later television, we're trying to run like the fourth industrial revolution on one cylinder, which is the tech sector alone. And another issue with a lot of those tech innovations, they make leisure time much, much better, and they don't always make us that much more productive at work. They may even distract us at work. So we live in this world where just staying at home is so much nicer. Amazon brings you things, you stream Netflix, you surf the internet, but we're more inward looking, more passive as a result.
If our lives are, I don't know, happier, better, there's been a lot of talk, of course, about how potentially young men being so enthralled by great video games might actually be hurting the productivity stats and workforce participation stats and that sort of thing. Is that necessarily such a bad thing? I mean, how do we account for that greater enjoyment in free time in these calculations?
No, I don't think it's necessarily bad. But here's the thing: it can be rational for each individual, but bad for the collectivity. And the US is a country where household savings is quite low. We have a lot of debt of different kinds. And you can't pay off your debt with leisure time or with your Facebook account. So if we were, say, more thrifty and more orderly, if we were in some ways more like Denmark, they're in a sense the masters of complacency, maybe we could make it work. But I don't see that right now we're on a track to make it work.
That point about it being individually maybe making sense, but collectively being a bad idea, sort of reminded me of some ideas you talked about in stubborn attachments, where it seemed to me you made a very strong case, a moral case, actually, for economic growth being a very critical thing for us to push for. Of course, on the left, a lot of folks say, well, maybe growth is overrated and we don't really need growth and we should just be happy where we're at. But that doesn't really seem to me to be your viewpoint.
Yes, societies without growth tend to decay and fall apart, and eventually they're conquered or they collapse under the weight of their own internal contradictions. So you often see the same with organizations. There's a sense of, grow or die, and it's embedded in the nature of reality at multiple levels.
One thing you mentioned in the book, the rise of monopolies, oligopolies, as sort of part of this complacency. And there are a number of areas you point out, cell phones, airlines, health insurers. And that also seems to me to be kind of a natural, maybe even almost inevitable, unless government steps in with some strong antitrust actions. And so I was wondering what you thought about that. I mean, are we doing enough in antitrust to try to help encourage competitive markets and all the good stuff that comes from competitive markets?
Well, I think you have to look at that sector by sector. I mean, my nomination for the biggest villain would be the hospital sector. And there I feel we haven't done enough. When it comes to cell phones, actually, since I wrote the book, even though it's not long ago, cell phone prices for the services have really tumbled. And that appears to be a pretty positive trend, showing that's a lot more competitive. So it really would depend on the area. Airlines, you have fewer companies flying, but in terms of the price behavior, it appears to be entirely acceptable. So I'd just say it depends. Some areas, yes.
So in some areas where there are what are sometimes called natural monopolies, I would imagine government regulation might make more sense then.
But what's a natural monopoly? It's not always easy to tell by looking at it. Like, you wouldn't obviously think a hospital would be one, but there are so many now, even pretty populated areas with basically maybe just two hospitals, and the prices have gone up a lot. And it's the sort of service that if you can't pay for it, I mean, it's really a serious life problem. It's not like, oh, there's a monopoly in paper clips, so you have to use fewer of them. So again, I would start there. Healthcare costs have been a major problem for this country for a long time, and that's one reason for it.
Another point of complacency you talk about, and this obviously hits home for me in my profession, is education. And you point out, at the top of the pile for education rankings, it's the same list of schools year after year after year. And I'm wondering, what do you think drives that? And is that necessarily such a bad thing that Harvard is, number one or number two for the last, probably 50, 60 years, if not more than that?
Well, I think it shows how much that market is based on reputation and credentials, and that there haven't been that many new ideas when it comes to how to do it. And I do think that's a sign of stagnancy. Harvard's a wonderful institution. But nonetheless, I find it striking, say, when professors get tenure, as far as we can measure it, they don't really start taking more chances. It seems to me something's wrong with that. All the talk is about safe spaces in universities. To some extent, that's justifiable. But I also think people develop an expectation that nothing said should ever harm them or be something uncomfortable to them. And I think that's another manifestation of this complacency.
Now, we weren't always like this. I mean, and so obviously the question becomes, well, what happened? And so again, in the book, you talk about a lot of factors, but I'm wondering, which would you single out as being primarily responsible for this increase in complacency?
Well, first and foremost, we exhausted a lot of the low-hanging fruit that we had after the end of World War II, and that was a natural development. We grew wealthier and more risk averse. But I would say the other, this is a kind of pure coincidence, that at the same time, we get all these tech innovations that make staying at home more attractive relative to being out there in some way.
And another part of this is something I really didn't expect is segregation. And you point out a number of ways that segregation is actually on the rise. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what sort of segregation you see on the rise and why we should be concerned about it. I mean, assuming we should, of course.
There are many types of segregation. One is segregation by income. So that is much stronger today than several decades ago. Rich people live next to other rich people, poorer people next to others. There are fewer mixed neighborhoods. There's a fair amount of research that implies this is probably bad for upward mobility. Another kind of segregation, of course, is racial. There, the picture is more complicated. Some parts of America, such as the suburbs, are more integrated. Uh, that's a positive development, in my view. But both a lot of cities, expensive cities, and many parts of the South, there's really much less racial integration than there had been, say, in the 1990s. And I think that is a sign America is not solving much of its race problem. I wouldn't say it's proof, but overall, to me, that is a negative development.
And it seems to me that's related to something else you talk about very much is matching, which is something, of course, that most people really like, being able to be matched up with the neighborhood or a potential partner or music or news that they like. The positives are pretty clear, but you also look at the negative consequences. And one of those, at least one really important one, I think, is that matching seems to exacerbate inequality. It allows the top businesses, the most successful people to attract like people. And I was wondering if there's anything we can really do about that. I mean, it seems to me that as long as we have this technology, the top businesses are naturally going to use it. And there's sort of an inevitable inequality that comes from this.
That's correct. You see this in the productivity data. Like the productive firms have improved a lot, and a lot of laggard firms are more or less operating at the same level. The productive ones are now sometimes called super firms. I don't know any direct fix for this. Obviously, if there are ways you can stimulate firms, institutions, households at lower levels of income or productivity to do more catch up, that would be good. That's easier said than done. You know, there are big benefits to concentrating that talent, and having, say, Silicon Valley produce so much tech is one of those. But I think there are benefits and costs. And just at least some part of this, I feel we should be concerned about. There's been like a talent drain from rural America also. Regions tend to be like winner regions or loser regions. There's not catch up the way we saw in the data in earlier decades. And you notice this when you drive around America, I think, or even look at how people vote.
Yeah, and it seems to me one approach to solving this, and some on the left would like this, is sort of the way that a lot of professional sports leagues have handled it. Is when there's too much of a concentration of talent, they impose what's sometimes called a luxury tax, say in the NBA, or they have drafts where the last pick first and the first pick last, and that sort of thing. But I'm guessing that you wouldn't be advocating anything like that for the economy as a whole.
Well, I think we should be open to all sorts of ideas. But at least immediately, I'm not sure how analogs would work. So you could have like a really bad firm, have the right to sort of draft or hire the best students out of Harvard. It just seems like you're misallocating talent and you have to infringe on people's freedoms. So I really would like that we all talk about more creative solutions. But these are hard problems to solve.
Yeah, yeah, without a doubt. Now, one thing you mentioned earlier, and it's something that really surprised me, is how much more docile we've become. You point out, this is an amazing statistic, is during an 18-month period in 1971 to 1972, there were an average of 5 domestic bombings every day. And of course, in the past few decades, we don't see anything like that. We haven't seen anything like the Watts riots in the 60s or the LA riots in 92. We get these mostly peaceful demonstrations. Now, granted, there are sometimes injuries and even deaths, but it's a lot milder. Why is that?
Some of it is that police technique has become better. Some of it is crime in general has fallen for reasons we don't always understand. But I think overall, America looked at itself, saw the mid to late 60s, the early 70s, and just said, this cannot continue. You had candidates on the right running against crime, promising to be tough, with some costs also, but they did actually get the level of crime down. And I think Americans overall thought, well, this is a good bargain. I think we've taken that bargain too far, in essence. It's not that I want more crime per se, but I think we've invested too much in safety, and we think the level of crime is much higher than it is. And the 60s were a much more dynamic time than today by most measures, including what you would call America's cultural presence in the world.
And there are some people who would say that we've gone too far in, I guess, not in squelching crime, but with the militarization of police forces. And certainly there have been so many cases that, that have come to light in the media of police seemingly using improper force in murders or manslaughter and what have you. And so do you think that that's been part of this sort of overreaction
Of
for
course,
safety?
and too much incarceration, too many long terms. Uh, prosecutors throwing the book at people more, plea bargains becoming tougher. All of these, to me, are dangerous steps down the wrong direction, even though obviously there are some benefits to having more people locked up.
Well, I was going to ask you about the number of people we have locked up. I think our incarceration rate is right now the highest in the world, I believe. And it seems to me that represents a massive loss of human potential, right?
And it's just a failure. I mean, even if you think many of those people need to be there, which of course is the case, we failed at some earlier stage in terms of creating opportunity for others.
And some would argue that many of the people who are in prison for relatively minor nonviolent drug offenses, for instance, could be, instead of wards of the state, could be out in jobs, earning money, contributing to our overall productivity. And of course, they're not.
There are companies out there that are doing more to try to hire ex-cons, people who want to ensure that formerly convicted felons still have voting rights. All of those are very positive movements, and I'm happy to see we have as much of them as we do. I think those deserve much more support.
Now, there are some people, though, who might argue that, well, it's true that these riots that caused billions of dollars in damage or hundreds of millions of dollars in damage and these deaths were horrific things, but that's the sort of thing that can sort of galvanize the public and create an environment for change the way that a sort of a peaceful demonstration where everyone just sort of mills around and speaks angry words and then goes home at the end of the day really can't. Do you think there's anything to that?
Well, I want to steer people away from the mentality of thinking that the level of violence in a society is a kind of lever they can push and pull on. And they can ask, should it be more? Should it be less? I mean, there are things we can do to influence it. I think we've gone too far in terms of being paranoid. But one of the lessons of the book is people make these individual decisions that are really hard or maybe even undesirable for the collectivity to control. And that's going to set a lot of what happens in society. And this movement toward complacency, it's been so strong, so multidimensional. It's very hard to fight against it. There's an overwhelmingness to it, so many different dimensions. And I think in a way that's the more important perspective than kind of sitting in your armchair and trying to adjust the lever. How much disorderliness for next year, sir? And then you do some kind of careful calculus. We don't have those choices.
Now, sort of as a contrast to the United States, you look at China. Growth rates and economic mobility obviously are a lot higher. And there are plenty of people who would say, well, see, we need to do something because China's going to, eat our lunch in the years to come. But again, and I'm coming off maybe as a horrible pessimist here. It seems to me that this trend might be somewhat inevitable. Going back to the Great Stagnation, and you look at that low-hanging fruit. They have plenty of smart, uneducated kids. Plenty of land still, technological breakthroughs with all those people that they're educating. I mean, I would think China as well as India, they still have plenty of room there where we just don't. And so given that, is sort of the economic ascendancy of China and India in the 21st century more or less inevitable, do you think?
Well, I think it's highly likely. The word inevitable makes me a little nervous,
Yeah.
but they are already subsidizing our complacency with their own work, their own risk taking. In areas like artificial intelligence, drones, biomedicine, I wouldn't quite say China's ahead of us, but they're possibly on the verge of being ahead of us. And just like the United States in some ways subsidized how the United Kingdom wanted to live during the 20th century, China and to a lesser extent India will do that for the US. I mean, the good news is they're working for us. That's great. It's good for them. But the bad news is we will be able to postpone facing hard decisions about our own future.
Now, I mean, a lot of people would look at this in terms of it being a zero-sum game. And I'm wondering, is it necessarily a bad thing for the United States if China or India become greater economic powers relative to the United States?
It's mostly a good thing. The economic side is pretty clearly positive sum. And a lot of America's poorest people, when they shop at dollar stores or Walmart, I mean, they're buying cheap goods basically from China. It's why they've actually seen more real income growth than a lot of the middle class. The problem, I would say, is the military dimension, which is not at all what my book is about. And I don't know how we should handle that. But just on the economic side, it's clearly very positive sum. I'm not sure, say, for people who live in Taiwan, it's entirely comforting in every way.
Yeah, one argument, of course, would be that the stronger our economic ties, the less likely there is to be any sort of military engagement.
People used to say that, but I don't think it's believed anymore because
Really?
China still seems expansionist. And there's a lot of countries we trade plenty with, including Russia more before sanctions. And those countries haven't liberalized and have done some bad things. So I would say that one's, up for
Hmm.
grabs.
I'm wondering, off of that, do you think that China, I mean, I think about what China's doing in that region of the country, and you could perhaps draw some parallels to what the United States did in sort of our region of the world when we were becoming the great economic power of the 20th century or so. So maybe it's just sort of limited to that region. They want to have greater influence in their own backyard, just like we did 100 or so years ago.
Did and still do.
Yeah,
The Monroe Doctrine has never been repealed. So I agree. I think the parallels are striking, but that doesn't mean they're comforting.
right. Sure.
U.S. has had a lot of war in its history and for its rise, and we don't want China to have the same. So
People on the left, especially, like to talk a lot about intergenerational mobility, and that's how likely you are to stay in the same income quartile as your parents, arguing that's a good way to measure opportunity. A while back on the show, I talked to Jacob Hacker, who's a political scientist, and his argument is that it's not just that mobility is down in the United States, but that mobility in the United States is down relative to other countries like us, rich, developed countries. And so from that, he concludes that this isn't just something that has happened, but it's the result of policies, and he looks to conservative policies that we have made in the last 20, 30, 40 years here in the United States. And I'm wondering if you agree with that.
I only agree with some of it. I agree that intergenerational mobility is down and this is bad. Uh, I think there's one big part of that that's not being measured, and that's that the U.S. successfully absorbs so many immigrants and vastly boosts their mobility. That's not picked up in these numbers. But still, the fact that it's down for native born Americans ought to concern us. I don't think, in fact, if you consider everything, it's down relative to Denmark. I think that's a mismeasurement. I'm not sure policy is the main reason why it is down. If you look at social welfare expenditures through the welfare state, Kevin Drum, who writes for Mother Jones, a left-wing outlet, I mean, that's basically more or less a straight line upwards, for decades. Now, maybe we're spending the money the wrong way, but it's just much harder for a large, very diverse society with a lot of federalism to fix many of its local problems than would be the case, say, in Denmark or Sweden.
So do you think that there are any countries that are good benchmarks for us, or are we just so unique as in the United States that we really don't have any countries we can reasonably compare ourselves to in some of these statistics?
Well, the best benchmark is Brazil, and we beat them hands down.
Okay.
So, of the large countries in the world, the really large countries, we're the only one that's well governed. Now, we ought to be more like the smaller countries. I think that's a good aspiration. It's just not easy to do. And when we rely on federalism, I find often a lot of our states disappoint us and they resort to NIMBYism and barriers. You see this also in terms of whether people can vote. That's a symbol of other things, in my view. So the traditional American federalism, let the states compete, they'll all sort it out. I don't think that's quite working right now. So our federalism maybe is overrated, is one way to think about our problems.
So then that would suggest that more solutions at the national level or for action from Congress rather than waiting for states to do certain things, I guess, especially with these sort of NIMBY issues.
I wrote a column for Bloomberg not that long ago where I argued occupational licensing, which now occurs at the city, state, and sometimes county levels, that should just all be federalized. Some things need licenses, fine, let's agree on that. But let's not have every city, be requiring licenses for dog walkers, interior designers, and so on. I think that's just limiting opportunity.
And it seems like that's one of those things that reasonable people would say, well, of course, and yet states, that's always been a core function of the states. And I think politically that would just be incredibly difficult to do.
Yes, I'm an impractical man in many ways.
Now, part of, before I forget, you mentioned Brazil. I kind of let that go, but I know listeners are going to want to say, well, wait a second, Brazil? Why would you compare us to Brazil? So I have to ask you that.
Well, Brazil was richer than what are now the United States in the middle of the 18th century. Colonized by Europeans, a history with slavery, a multi-ethnic society, large numbers of immigrants coming in the early 20th century. Physically, Brazil is not quite as large as the US, but it's pretty big. It's almost comparable. They have 200 million people, give or take, not as many as we have. But again, if you're looking for a comparison country, that's clearly it. And my goodness, I mean, we're doing much better than they are.
Part of the problem, one of many parts of the problem, is that the biggest part of our federal budget is locked in through these mandatory spending programs. That's mostly Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. And even though defense spending isn't mandatory, it's really, I would say, essentially.
Oh, it is, yeah. Pensions and personnel and weapon systems, procurement cycle, it's very locked in.
Yeah, so, I mean, that only leaves us right around 17% of the budget that can be changed in yearly appropriations, which clearly makes it a lot harder to change things up in response to changes in the environment. But that's the downside. But it seems to me that the other side of this is that this is part of our making long-term commitments to, well, some of our most vulnerable citizens. And so I'm wondering if you think that's a worthwhile trade-off.
Well, keep in mind, net transfers in this country go to the elderly who are wealthier than the average. Now, many of the elderly do, in fact, need what they get, but these are by no means entirely progressive transfers from the point of view of equality. That said, I don't think we're ever going to stop doing them for the most part. So we are truly locked in. To imagine something like the space program being done today or the Manhattan Project, it's simply no longer possible. And those were two of our greatest achievements. The Manhattan Project was several percent of GDP at its peak. And we did build an atom bomb that won World War II. And if the Nazis had gotten it first, my goodness. And then to put a man on the moon in basically 7 years from scratch. I mean, we can't even build a bridge in 7 years, or maybe not even 17 years. So that just shows how much we've changed in terms of overall bureaucratization. And a lot of people who make this point are on the right or conservatives, libertarians, and, I share their concerns, but the left should be just as worried. Like, for government to do what the left wants it to do, it's so hard because we regulate government itself so much.
And of course, the answer, generally speaking, on the left is, well, tax rates are far too low and we can go much higher, like the rates that we had in the 1950s and even the 1960s. And so, and that would take care of a lot of problems, though I'm guessing that's not your preferred solution.
Well, I would say it's a separate debate how high taxes should be. But I would stress this, that if you don't change our culture and laws today, and all you do is raise taxes, you will not get what you want from that bargain.
Now, one section of your book is democracy, or is democracy dead? And in that section, you take a look at the world's three largest political economic units: China, which is obviously undemocratic.
Right.
The EU is democratic, but it's this kind of technocratic sort of thing, run out of central headquarters, and they have a non-democratic central bank. And then we have the U.S., where we just pointed out the majority of our spending's locked in, and we have our own very powerful, semi-independent, not very democratically accountable central bank. And of course, a lot of people say, well, that this loss of democratic rule, if you will, is a big problem. But when I read that, it made me think about your colleague Brian Kaplan and
Yes.
his book on economic irrationality, his great book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. And so I'm wondering, well, is less democracy, at least in some areas, necessarily such a bad thing?
I'm more sympathetic toward the idea of having more democracy than Brian is. But that said, there are clearly areas where we should have less. Should we be electing all these judges and dog catchers? I would say obviously no. Should the Federal Reserve be run by referendum? I would say obviously no. Uh, so if you ask, where we're at right now, I think America is the one big part of the world that really has kept a democratic system compared to the EU or China. And I would say how well that's going to go. Like it really is up to us. And this is one of the things on the line here. In addition to wanting better lives for ourselves, our children, and all of that, like we're kind of fighting for democracy. And if our model fails, we're flushing a lot of loyalty to democracy down the toilet. And I just hope people take that very seriously.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the same time, I don't want to elect every judge or California referenda. I think that's a bad system. So it's not that I always want to make politics more democratic. But the EU has gone too far in its direction. There's plenty of rebellion against that. Of course, China should hope to evolve to be more democratic.
And well, and in this country, of course, in the book, you suggested maybe the election of Donald Trump is part of what might be a growing rebellion against this complacency. And certainly that makes sense to me. That, and you look at Brexit and a number of other things. But it also seems to me there's another way to look at the election of President Trump. I want to get your take on it. That it was sort of the last gasp, if you will, of old white guys. And if you take a look at the election, the polls after the election, say the under 30, the non-white vote demographics. I mean, they went pretty clearly, pretty strongly for Hillary Clinton, who I would say is without a doubt sort of a complacent class elite poster person. So is that a reasonable alternate explanation?
Well, I see both candidates as serving complacency. Think of Trump's main slogan, "Make America Great Again." Very backward looking. It used to be the new frontier, the great society, very forward looking. Trump himself, he doesn't know that much policy detail. A lot of what he does is rhetoric, which it can be offensive, but a lot of the policies are not actually that dramatic. It turns out we're going to stay in NAFTA, which I'm happy about, I might add, but no big change there. There's talk of getting back into TPP again. Again, good news, I would say. Sometimes I call Trump a kind of placebo president, like the rhetoric is the placebo for his supporters. And what you actually get is a lot more ordinary, but combined with some degree of offensiveness and polarization than maybe what had been promised.
Yeah, without a doubt, in the polarization and offensiveness.
We still have Obamacare, whether you like that or not, right? Many things just aren't changing that much.
And certainly, in part, I would just because the president has been frustrated in some ways at getting his agenda through our institutional system of checks and balances, if not really something he seems all that comfortable with, I guess I would say. But, well, let me be optimistic for a minute here. My optimistic version of the future is that in my lifetime, and I'm 49 now, so barring being hit by a bus or something, I see advances in artificial intelligence and biotechnology and fields like that, potentially bringing us an era of really massive growth. And okay, maybe it will increase inequality because all this stuff will go to the rich first, certainly, but also it has the potential to lift up everyone so much that inequality just doesn't matter all that much. Mm-hmm. In other words, I guess I'm saying it's a future that technology lets us have both the safety and security that we have now, along with a lot more material prosperity. And am I being too optimistic?
Probably not. I share that vision. I think it's coming. I don't know when. I don't know how quickly, but I do see a kind of race going on. On the other side of the ledger are growing debts, a decline in the quality of our governance, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction around the world. So which side of that balance is going to win the race? I find that very difficult to predict.
So you said you're somewhat optimistic. I wonder, though, do you think, barring military conflicts and things like that, which certainly are a possibility, do you think that the revolt, the signs of revolt against complacent class that you mention in the book, Donald Trump, even if he is kind of a force for nostalgia or complacency, but Brexit and things like that, kind of a revolt against the elites, I guess you could say. Do you see that continuing and kind of leading us to some place of chaos and then maybe a new normal emerging from that?
That's what I see. As you know, I predicted that in the book. It's been happening much more quickly than I had predicted because I wrote that part of the book before I thought Trump would win, uh, before Brexit, for that matter. So if you kind of read into my tone, there's a feeling of, well, 5, 7 years from now, these sorts of things will start happening, and they happen in less than a year.
Yeah, and so I guess we're in for certainly a very difficult transition period, a period of, I don't know if you want to call it creative destruction exactly, but then hopefully we stabilize at a different, better level.
I expect that. I think that's the most likely scenario. We go through our own new version of the 60s and 70s. People get very upset about it, but we do reemerge on the other side with a new complacency also.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings me to one of the questions I had about Hyman Minsky, and you mentioned him in the book, and his financial instability hypothesis, which basically, to oversimplify, stability is inherently destabilizing. Good times lead to complacency, and then that inevitably results in a pushback and a crash. And it seems to me that in the book, you tie this into sort of a broader, more cyclical view of history. Great powers rise and fall, and progress. Advances and retreats and so forth, and that's sort of in opposition to what I would call maybe a Steven Pinkerish sort of view that things are just almost inexorably getting better and better all the time, and will kind of continue to do that. And so, I mean, I guess though, in the end, it seems to me that you do think that even though there are fits and starts, that progress is, well, maybe not inevitable, that word makes you uncomfortable, but the future will be brighter than the present.
Odds are that's the case, and certainly in the world's emerging economies, that very clearly seems true.
Well, I think on that optimistic note, I think I'll end right there. Tyler Cowen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguyspage. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.